Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Jensen. I am a senior technical architect at EY, and I have the luxury of presenting to you today at DynamicsCon. So today we're going to be talking about reporting in Dynamics 365 for finance and supply chain management. As I mentioned, Ian Jensen, senior technical architect at EY. I've got a little bit of an intro here about me. I'm not going to read through all of this. The key pieces here, I've been working with AX since the 2009 days, and in the AX7 product cycle, I've been there since the beginning. So I've seen the evolution of some of the reporting technologies that we're going to talk about today, even across this most recent product cycle. I do want to pause here and thank a whole bunch of people. I want to thank the organizers of DynamicsCon. I think this is a really special conference. It's a cool idea that we're able to vote sessions in as an audience. You know, I present at these, but I also attend, and I really like the control of material that's relevant to me. So very cool conference. Thank you to the organizers. Obviously, also thank you to everybody that voted for my session. Hopefully today you get what you voted for. You get some useful content out of this. And finally, I wanted to thank the other presenters at the conference here. This is you know, I personally know this is a lot of work to set these things up. I've learned a lot attending past Dynamics cons. So thanks all around. It's a great event that we all get to be part of. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about who did I gear this session toward. Historically, for anybody that's seen me at other conferences, I'm often doing tech deep dives or demos. This session's a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more guiding hand type material. So there should be pretty broad applicability in terms of what we're talking about today. I would expect technical and functional reporting decision makers to get something out of these sessions, especially if you're upgrading to F&O, but also if you're just looking at how am I going to future-proof our existing report infrastructure in the event that in the future we are migrating to one of these newer technologies. So I just talked a little bit about my goals, but really the big goal for me in this session for you should be able to leave this with a pretty confident idea of, you know, give me a reporting problem, and I have a level of confidence in picking one or two platforms that make the most sense to fit that problem. I'm also actually going to share, this last bullet's important, I'm going to share some kind of notes from the field on places where I've maybe seen misapplications or drawbacks on the various reporting technologies. Okay, so what are we actually going to go through today? It's going to be a whirlwind tour of Ian's favorite and most frequently encountered reporting technologies. So what are we covering? We're going to talk about SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services, Old Faithful. We're going to talk about Power BI, the not so new kid on the block, but still the popular kid. Excel add-in, which is of course everybody's favorite because everybody knows Excel. Financial reporting for finance teams, general electronic reporting, bring your own database, which itself is not a reporting technology, but is still important to the reporting story in F&O. And then finally, we'll do an overall comparison of the technologies that I'm talking through here today. I do want to pause here again. A couple of things. I know this is not an exhaustive list of reporting technologies. These are just the technologies that I work with the most and see the most in the field. A related note there, if you want to talk about other technologies or ask questions, there is a chat while this session is going on that you can talk about things that Ian missed, or maybe they're wrong, or you just want to know more about something I'm talking about. Definitely use the chat. At the end of my session, I will be around live to attempt to answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. I definitely don't know it all, but I've probably seen most of what's out there. Okay, so we're going to start our tour, like I mentioned, with SQL Server Reporting Services, or SSRS. Before I get into any of the content here, I do want to warn you, I have a very soft spot for SSRS. It is where I kind of cut my teeth in the consulting space. So I probably like it too much. I'm aware of that. So take what I'm about to say with that grain of salt, that, you know, if Ian comes off like an SSRS fanboy, it's because he is. So we'll start with the basics. What is it? For those of you that don't know, there is a tuned version of SSRS for F&O. That's the tool set I'm talking about here. It kind of came into its own in the 2012, AX 2012 product cycle. It's, I would say, stabilized at this point and kind of the workhorse for most of the internal, most of the internal reporting in F&O. So nuts and bolts, we're not going to get too deep into nuts and bolts like I mentioned, but just from an architecture perspective, it's important to understand that when we run an SSRS report, usually there is some X++ code running to query, manipulate the data. And then there can be some other cool things that happen in the report design itself, the SSRS report design. I'm skipping over a whole bunch of technical details. Like I said, this isn't going to be a tech deep dive, but that's kind of the high level architecture that you need to be aware of with this option. One of the bigger drawbacks in I guess the broader ether of enterprise reporting is that the SSRS plugin for F&O is generally limited to reporting on F&O data. So you're not going to have a super easy time of incorporating data from other systems unless you have an integration to bring that data in. And then finally, I feel like this last bullet gets lost perhaps most in the conversation. This is still in 2021 the primary native reporting tool in F&O. So I think that a lot of times it gets dismissed for kind of more quote unquote exciting technologies, but it's still there doing a lot of the work on tabular reporting in F&O. And I personally am still recommending it for a lot of reporting needs if that data lives exclusively in F&O. I should mention that the structure of I'm kind of structured to a fault with my presentations that are kind of like these guiding hand presentations. So all of the sections we're going to go through are structured like this. If you're watching this on YouTube, you kind of jump around to the topics you're curious about. So we're going to talk about basics of each technology and then pros and cons of each technology. So looking at what are the upsides of SSRS? The biggest one, it is the only direct access, direct database access reporting technology that you can use with F&O. Everything else is managed data access in some way, but with the SSRS tools in F&O, I can actually query the data set directly. So that is definitely the biggest advantage you have when you're building reports in SSRS versus some of the other tools we're going to talk about. Another kind of upside related to the history of the tool is that there are well-established design patterns and a ton of standard examples from standard Microsoft reports in F&O. You don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. There's probably a report that does something very similar to what you're trying to do with SSRS. So it's kind of a well-beaten path. That's definitely an advantage. And then something that I'm going to kind of compare and contrast with the other technologies is this last bullet, which is that SSRS is, the reports are part of the AOT, the code is part of the AOT, the application object tree. So it's part of the core code base of F&O. You're not managing it in some external server or system. It's tightly integrated. There are, just full disclosure, plenty of downsides to SSRS. It's not a citizen dev tool. You absolutely need developers to build SSRS reports. Because the framework is so broad in what it was meant to accomplish in 2012 and even in F&O, it can be cumbersome to manage, to build SSRS reports and update them. And troubleshooting can be a challenge because there are so many places that the tools can break. I have here that it can also be slow. Usually slow reports are either a design problem or a code problem. The framework itself does have some general performance limitations, but usually that downside is resolvable, I guess is what I would say. It's not, SSRS is not super good at visualizations. There are tools that you can use to add visualizations to your SSRS reports, but there are other tools that we're going to talk about that are better for visualizing your data. And then I have last here, I kind of already alluded to this, but I don't think SSRS is like the shiny muscle car reporting tool that maybe it was once considered to be, but I still, like I mentioned up front, I'm still partial to it. So don't count it out yet, I would say. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Power BI. So, I mentioned it's the not so new kid on the block anymore. It's still a really compelling tool. It's something that I, in the world of consulting, I've been talking about usually upfront on pretty much every project. So definitely relevant for the world of enterprise data reporting. So the basics of Power BI, it is more of a general purpose tool. There's not a super tight integration special add-in like we have with SSRS in Power BI. It's more of a general purpose tool, which gives it its own set of advantages, namely that I have a lot of different data sources that I can query with Power BI compared to a more purpose-built or a more purpose-built tool. So I would say, from my perspective, Power BI is generally the best choice if you're going to do a visualization heavy report. And it's also the tool of choice if you are going to be doing any form of interactive reporting or a dashboard with multiple screens. The upsides of Power BI, obviously the biggest one is that, or maybe not obviously, it is accessible to power users. You can, most organizational users are able to download the Power BI editor, desktop editor, and tweak reports. It is also good, like I mentioned, for integrating non-F&O data. So that matters increasingly in our increasingly fragmented enterprise data reporting world. I mentioned the visualizations are, I would say, industry leading. And something that maybe is not obvious, this last bullet, the user licensing, you have an advantage there if you have users who are going to be reporting only users. So I've seen this on in some orgs, like the C-level folks don't really need F&O access, but they do want BI type data. For an organization that doesn't have a ton of F&O user licenses, that's like a significant cost reduction to just do the BI licensing and not have to necessarily license that user in F&O directly. The downsides of Power BI, this first bullet's probably the most important. It is misunderstood in a lot of ways, and I'll give some examples here. I see a lot of F&O data only tabular reports in Power BI. That's not really what Microsoft's intent for the interface of Power BI is. And that's, I would argue, probably not what they want the tabular data in F&O to be coming out through. So that's kind of a misapplication I see a lot. Maybe an even bigger one is that, I mentioned the desktop version of the Power BI editor. I see a lot of people actually running their BI reports kind of in preview mode in that editor as their primary consumption model, which is, again, not really the way the framework's meant, the tool set's meant to be used. The big downside of doing that, just in case any of you out there are doing that, you're kind of beholden to the performance of your work machine if you do that. And right now I have the luxury of a pretty fast work machine, but in the past there's some machines that those reports would run really slow on. So use the web services that are designed to run these reports quickly. Don't run those reports on essentially an editor, I guess would be my takeaway message there. Next bullet here, most of the sources for Power BI are external. So why is that a downside? Power BI itself can be basically as fast as you want it to be, but it is limited. When we're querying external data sources, Power BI's performance is limited to the speed of whatever that external endpoint is. And that kind of gets into my next bullet, the OData trap, which is that if I'm externally reporting on F&O data in Power BI, a lot of report designers will default to using the OData endpoints in F&O, which are notorious for kind of slowing down when you start getting into massive data sets, which oftentimes is what we want to report on in Power BI. So I said all that to say you really need to be careful when you're designing your data sets in Power BI in ways that maybe you can be a little bit more bold, I guess, with the other reporting tools. Next downside here, I mentioned SSRS is natively managed in the code base of F&O. Power BI can be. Most of the consumption models I've seen at clients, they're doing it externally. They're managing them in the Power BI web portal or somewhere outside of the F&O code base. So anytime we are adding external reporting tools, that's overhead for just managing those reports. Plus, next bullet here, you're also potentially managing separate licenses if you can't take advantage of the native Power BI licensing with your F&O licenses. I should have a little bit of a tangent here briefly. I said I wasn't going to get into tech nuts and bolts, but it would be worth it to just briefly talk about data entities, which most of these tools that I would call external filter their data through data entities in F&O. I'm not going to do like a tech deep dive on how data entities work, but I would suggest, again, if you're watching this on YouTube, maybe pause, go pull up Microsoft's article on data entities, get the kind of high level understanding, come back. What I'm talking about for the rest of the presentation, I think will make more sense. But the key takeaway I would get at with data entities is that they're inherently going to slow down your querying the data in F&O. They have business logic built in. The endpoints that they go through have a little bit of overhead. Microsoft is doing great work always in trying to speed up the performance of these tools. But as soon as you're not directly hitting the database, there's going to be overhead. So I wanted to mention that here because that's something that Power BI falls prey to when we're using OData as a data source for reporting on F&O data. But all of the external reporting tools, if you go the OData route, are going to have similar issues without some form of caching anyways. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about the Excel add-in. This is one of my personal favorite tools to recommend. I think that in general, it's underutilized. So what is it? It is an add-in to Excel that allows you to get a live data view on a lot of these data entity-based data sets in F&O. So I've got screenshots here. This top screenshot is the connector and the designer in Excel, and the bottom one is the menu, I think it's the O365 menu in F&O, where you can go open some of these kind of canned reports. So like I mentioned, the live option is based on data entities. The two screenshots here represent kind of the two consumption models. So most people are using this bottom approach where like they go to the O365 menu, they pick their open in Excel option, and then an auto magic Excel workbook pulls up with that connection already pre-populated. That's what I would call the push model of reporting Excel data in F&O. The pull model is that I open Excel, I go to the add-in, the Microsoft Dynamics Excel add-in, and I kind of pull the data. I pick my data source from that side and pull it. You can go either way. I think some people get confused about that second scenario. So I just wanted to mention it, that you don't necessarily need to go into F&O and find a screen that has the thing you want. You could consume it from the Excel side as well. Last piece here that's going to matter more for our discussion in a minute is that this tool does require an add-in to Excel. And I'll explain why that's important, like I said, in the next slide here. Okay, so pros and cons of the Excel add-in. Obviously, the big pro, it's a familiar tool set. Most people know how to use Excel. I ironically would not call myself an Excel power user, but I've seen coworkers do great things with the tool. Another huge upside of Excel, reporting in Excel, is that you don't really need a developer to manage the data or the interface. You can do it on your own. It's always a good idea. Data structure can be a challenge if you haven't played with this before. So, I'm not gonna undercut my fellow devs out there. And also, I've been talking about licensing with some of the other tools. Most orgs have an O365 license that enables their users to access Excel. So that's not as big of a problem if you do your reporting in Excel. Downsides, I alluded to this moments ago. The data entity OData thing, that affects, that's how we're seeing that data, the live data in Excel. So that's a problem if you're loading huge amounts of data. The unmanaged mod thing. So because anybody can just open an Excel and save that off, modify the query and change the interface and save it off somewhere. They could email it to a coworker. The management of that style of report natively without additional effort is not super strong. Next bullet here, add-in security. This is like near and dear is not the right word. This is a huge pet peeve of mine that I'm going to talk about for probably too long. I mentioned that you have to have an add-in in Excel to use this feature. I have worked for a few partners now. Not a single partner that I've worked for has an IT team that has enabled access to this add-in. So for those of you out there working with your partners on a feature like this, they're almost certainly doing it in a Microsoft managed environment, or maybe an environment that their IT team doesn't have access to. But it's just an annoying, it's an annoying part of the use case of this tool set. And I have seen a lot of end users, same thing, their IT teams are kind of nervous about an add-in like this. So if you are going to do your reporting in Excel, it would behoove you to talk to your IT team early about, are they willing to unlock that access to that add-in? Otherwise, it's going to kind of sink your boat. Something that is also a downside of the Excel tool is that you can actually, it's a two-way tool. So I can read data out of F&O, and if I know what I'm doing, I can actually push data back into F, like I can modify it and push it back into F&O. This is not as big of an issue as I originally thought it would be back in the day. I think part of it is that you have to be pretty intentional and know what you're doing to push the data back to F&O. But the point is, if you have a user in F&O that has sufficient security privileges to like change something in the front end, they can do it in Excel too and potentially accidentally corrupt the data. So it's worth mentioning. And then last thing I would mention here is I have seen some Excel-based reports where they went pretty far with functions. Like if I have to scroll through your function to understand all the conditions and the lookups and the comparisons you're doing, at some point you really should be looking at what's a more persistent, what's a tool that's better at handling complex query or filter conditions. So that's kind of the ups and downs of Excel. There is a little bit of extra content that I added here around actually managing those Excel reports. And I thought it was important to throw this in because when I tried to find material online to reference, to point you all at, there's not a lot. So let me talk about what this is. I mentioned that the default story on Excel reporting is kind of unmanaged. That's true, but there actually is a feature in F&O that your admins, your org admins can use to save off the best reports in your organization or the most useful reports and associate them with data entities, which themselves are associated with screens in your system to expose those reports for all of your users. So I've got a screenshot here. I made like a DynamicsCon document template. It took me like a minute to upload this thing. It's a very easy way to do kind of basic report management in F&O and to allow your teams to edit their own reports. So big fan of the Excel reporting feature set in F&O. Like I said, I would argue it may even be a little bit underutilized. Okay, now we're getting into some technologies that, if I'm being honest, I don't use as much. And the good news is the reason I don't use them as much is because they're relatively refined, they're user-facing tools, and devs don't get brought in a ton to work on these things. So yet another kind of set of topics that are worth discussing. So we're going to talk about financial reporting first. What is financial reporting? It is a custom reporting framework within F&O. Targeted specifically to finance teams. That's why it's called financial reporting. One of the kind of killer features of financial reporting is that you don't need a Visual Studio. You don't need a code editor, a direct code editor, to change financial reporting reports. And there are quite a few off-the-shelf reports to start with, and then you can, as a power user or an administrator, make your own mods, make your own reports, again, without necessarily involving a developer or a developer environment. So what are the pros and cons of financial reports? The biggest pro is that it's targeted. Anytime that we can whittle down a tool set to a specific audience, it's usually going to work out better. So these reports are specific to finance teams, so are the building blocks that we use to build them, which is just kind of an inherent benefit of the tool set. I mentioned that these tools have been refined over time. Financial reporting is not a new tool. It's gone through some kinks. Even in the F&O product cycle, it went through some kinks, but it's relatively refined and performant at this point. And like I mentioned, users can edit the reports if they have sufficient security permissions anyways, which is obviously a big upside as well. When we talk about drawbacks of financial reporting, the biggest con is also the biggest pro, right? So it's a targeted audience that's using this tool set. You're not going to be able to do without, well, no, I'll just say you're not going to be able to do like inventory reports or sales reports or other broader use reports in financial reporting. To me, as a developer, the second bullet's probably the biggest downside. The design interface is obviously getting old. It's kind of a weird experience. When you go to edit these reports, I think it's called a Click Once app, gets downloaded and connects to the database, and you have to have like an add-in if you're doing it in Chrome. But it doesn't, in a world where so much of the D365 space is going toward a unified interface, this thing is starting to stick out. Other downsides, limited customizability. I have never been asked to go in and do like X++ mods to this tool set. I've heard it's difficult. And there is, because it's kind of this standalone thing that's still within the product, there is administrative overhead that comes with using this tool. For the tech folks watching this, I'm talking about all the data mart fun that we have with specifically the financial reporting data sets. Okay, this is another thing that Ian does not work on a lot, but is popular. We're talking about general electronic reporting. What is GER? It is a business document design management suite. The intent, Microsoft's, I believe, their intent in adding this tool set was to help organizations meet regulatory requirements on inbound and outbound business documents. So obviously for reporting, we're talking about the outbound business documents. It is another user configurable reporting tool, so you do not need a developer to work on GER reports. And it is, interestingly, these reports are manageable through LCS. There are other reporting tools that also have this feature, but as far as I'm aware, this is kind of the exclusive place that we manage GER reports. So that's a noteworthy bullet there. What are the upsides of GER? Like I said, it does help your organization meet international regulations. I say international because I haven't had to deal with GER a lot, but I'm aware that certain jurisdictions have really specific regulations around business documents. So that's an upside. Like I mentioned, it is user editable. There is what I would call a first class actually design interface in F&O. Like we're not opening some separate tool to work on these data and document formats. It's directly within F&O. It has native versioning, so I can specify which version of a document design or what version I want to access. And it supports external providers. So you can, I believe, purchase or load document formats from organizations outside your own if you don't want to deal with all the hoops of business document regulations. So what are the downsides of GER? And again, very biased toward a technical user's experience here. For me, the biggest downside is the designer's a little weird. And what I mean by that, everything is a design tree in the GER designer. The reason, I think, that everything is kind of the same kind of odd interface is because it is directly exposed in F&O. So I don't, when they built this, they didn't have, they were limited to what are the interface options in F&O. The thing that was the closest fit for what they wanted to build was design trees. But that means that in some places you're kind of shoehorning things that don't really fit in a tree structure. And one other thing I would mention on this, I don't have a bullet here, but one other thing I would mention on this is the formula language is very Excel-like by design, but that means you get into the same drawbacks where you have very code-looking formulas to manipulate your data model or your design, where if we were doing this in code, it would in some cases be less complex. Another issue that actually we see popping up in other report technologies as well is that you really have to have pretty good knowledge of the back end to use the front end design tool. So like you have to know table names. In some cases, you have to know like class names. For a power user to use this tool, they have to be like a super duper power user to know what they're working with. And then finally, last downside here, this is another thing that's technically separate from the code base. It's managed as data and not code. So you do have a management experience there. But again, once we're fragmenting how we're managing the report technologies, that's always overhead. So that's just something you need to keep in mind if you're going to go far down the GER rabbit hole. Okay. Finally, last technology I wanted to talk about was bring your own database, BYOD, and a little bit on data lakes. So what is BYOD? It is a feature in F&O that allows you to connect your F&O instance to a standalone Azure SQL instance, which gives you an indirect data mirror outside of F&O. Some of you are probably already thinking, this is why I've got this third bullet on here, why are we talking about this? It's not a reporting technology. It is foundational to many external reporting options, especially when we talk about, I've got it here, the kind of the minimal lift legacy report tools. So if your organization built external SSRS reports, you didn't use the old AX plugin, you're querying SQL directly, and you're looking at the, you've already got the sunk cost, and you're looking at the investment to upgrade to one of these other technologies I've talked about, and it's not feasible. This kind of gives you a little bit of a Band-Aid for at least a while to still do that direct SQL access, to port those direct SQL report options over to something where you still have access. It's not perfect because, like I mentioned, it's a mirror through the data entity, so you don't have one-to-one parity with your F&O data structure, but it is usually lower effort than completely migrating those reports to one of the newer technologies. And then the last bullet here I should mention, Data Lake is finally going to work with F&O. It's in public preview as of 2021. It has been in the works for, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been in the works for years. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this will in some way be replaced or augmented by Data Lake. I'm not talking about it here because it's still in preview, but this might be the last time I'm covering BYOD. Okay, real quick rundown of pros and cons. The big pro, it's the only externally queryable SQL Server option that you have with F&O, unless you do some really crazy custom stuff, but like off the shelf, this is really the only option. It's highly configurable. What do I mean by that? You can pick the entities that you want to sync out to the database. You can pick the frequency you want to synchronize them. You can configure, are we doing full pushes? Are we doing incremental data pushes? You have a lot of control of how this framework works for your organization. It is generally performant because, again, you have a lot of control of many of these performance affecting features that I just talked about. And I would argue that it is relatively maintainable because of the way that Microsoft has built the interface in F&O and because of the direct access that you have in the Azure SQL Server. So what are the downsides? Azure SQL is expensive. If you haven't looked, go look. It can be pricey. I mentioned earlier, it's not a true mirror. Don't get fooled into thinking that you've got a one-to-one copy of your F&O database. You do not. It's going through the data entities, which alter the view. The data entities are built for integrations and reporting. They're not built for a transactional translation of your data. It can be slow. This is another one of those things where usually if it's slow, it's because somebody's not tuning it right, but it can be slow. The incremental update tools have historically been kind of finicky because data entities are complicated and some work better than others for these updates. And then, I mentioned multiple frameworks have this last problem. There's a kind of confusing experience where when you synchronize an entity, you see the name of the entity in the front end. What you get over in BYOD is actually the backend staging table name from that entity. So if you don't know where to look in F&O to do that cross-reference, it can be kind of confusing. So that's definitely a downside of the way they've built the feature. Okay, so I think we're getting near the end here. I do want to do a quick run through of all of these technologies. Here's the cheat sheet slide. I'm always caveating with these things. This is a good cheat sheet. We just talked for 30+ minutes about the caveats of all these technologies. Don't make all of your decisions based on this one table or anybody's one table. But just for your reference, here's kind of my opinion on where these fit and where they don't. So let's run through these quickly. SSRS, where does it work? Rigid tabular printed reports. I'm not the first person that's going to tell you this, and probably not the last either, but that's the truth. Where does it come up short? It's not super interactive. The F&O specific plugin isn't good at getting external data sets, and it's just not user editable. It's not something where you're going to be able to avoid a conversation with a developer. Power BI, where does Power BI fit? It is best for interactive multi-data source visual reports. Where does it fall short? I've got performance with an asterisk here. I talked a lot about the entity and the OData problems that kind of sink Power BI's boat. But in general, I mean, whatever it's querying, that's what slows down Power BI. That's the ultimate problem there is you're stuck with the performance of external systems a lot with Power BI. And then I also mentioned, and I will repeat here, the user story is a little convoluted with Power BI. I'm aware of that. I think the partner community is aware of that. I'm happy to talk with whoever wants to talk about what, where Power BI reports make sense. The Excel add-in, best for simple reporting, things that users, a user could put together themselves without super robust knowledge of how all the data structures work in F&O. It's victim to the same performance problems as Power BI. It's not good for super complex data structures, and there are better tools for visualizations than Excel. FR, financial reporting, best for common finance reports, obviously, and then simple custom finance reports. So that kind of leads into what it's bad for. If we're making super complicated financial reports, you might want to go with SSRS or directly, or one of the other tools that allows for more robust data structure design. And obviously, if you're querying things that aren't finance related, there's better tools. GR, best for meeting regulations, essentially. Where does it not work? If you're not a super duper power user, or you don't have a super duper power user in your org that kind of specializes in this ER report design approach, it's a challenge. I personally find it challenging. I think it's just something I need to keep learning. Finally, BYOD. Where does BYOD work? It works for scenarios where you absolutely must have SQL Server access, and it does not work for interface design. There isn't an inherent interface design tool for Azure SQL, and it doesn't work for data. Actually, I didn't mention this earlier. So the BYOD's kind of its biggest shortcoming is if you don't have a data entity to expose the data to BYOD, then you have to build that entity to make that sync happen. So that can be additional dev overhead if you do find yourself in that situation. Okay, we made it. We're at the end. So I hope that you've been asking questions as we've gone through this in the chat. If you haven't, start typing now. We're about to get to the Q&A. If for some reason I'm not able to cover all of your questions in the Q&A, I am active on social media. I've got my LinkedIn pulled up here on screen, my Twitter handle, and my perpetually under construction personal website, which maybe will have something useful by the time this airs. So that's about it. I guess I'll wrap up here by, again, thanking the organizers. Thanks to those of you that voted me. Thanks to those of you that stuck around to the end here, and I hope you got something useful out of it. Hi, everybody. Thank you for making it through my review session. Hopefully you all got something out of it there. I see a lot of good questions coming in, so thank you for asking a bunch of questions here. John, where do we want to start?
I think we want to start a little bit towards the top. First question from Paul: what's your best practices for versioning Power BI models and reports? If you see that there.
Yeah, that is a good question. It kind of leads into, if we didn't get a bunch of questions, we had some topics I wanted to cover, and there's a related one here, which is the answer to that question kind of depends on which kind of Power BI you're setting up with F&O. So there's this, I think it's still called Power BI Embedded, that you can actually, it lives in the AOT and F&O, and the reports can be in there as well. That's really hard to set up and manage. So I don't usually, I historically recommended that. And then after a few projects where I had to do that myself, had to manage the code there and the deployments, we started steering more toward external Power BI. So if you're going to manage it externally, I would say whatever fits with the rest of your, if you have other reports, the rest of your report versioning. I've been a big proponent for a long time of a dev test release branch structure. I don't see why that wouldn't necessarily be something you could do with your PBIX files as well. I think there's, I haven't played with this a lot, but I think there is some native versioning capabilities within Power BI, the dashboards themselves. But for a dev audience, I would think that putting the files in Git or VSTS would be probably easier to manage. So good question. I don't have like a industry answer there, because it's so it's, I don't want to say scattered, but there's just so many different uses of Power BI right now on projects. There's not a magic bullet answer, but good question, Paul. John, what's next?
All right. One from Sophia. Can't you change the authorizations at the tables level to avoid the write back danger?
For the Excel add-in, I think is what we're talking about there. Yeah. So that's a good, Sophia, that's a good point. If a user, that's something I don't mention in the video that's worth adding for sure, that if you have access to corrupt data in F&O directly, then you have sufficient access to do it through the Excel add-in. So Sophia is right. If you remove a person's permissions, either table permissions or entity permissions to do a write on a certain data source, then that would be a way to protect your data. In reality, and I think I did mention this in the video, I was really worried when I first saw this feature come out, but we haven't, and I don't want to I don't want to give people a false sense of security, but we haven't had a lot of issues across the projects I've been on with users accidentally writing things back. You have to jump through some hoops to make it happen, but to be absolutely sure, yeah, that your data was safe, you would want to restrict users on sensitive data sources.
Awesome. I think you may have saw this as well. Brad asked, have you worked with customers that have opted for other third-party BI reporting tools?
Yeah, and I was kind of picking his brain on that. So I do have kind of, I don't want to say magic bullet, but I do have a first pass answer pretty consistently on that, which is BYOD. Most of the legacy reporting tools out there depend on direct SQL access, so it's a less painful lift if you start with that. Obviously, the answer my new Microsoft colleagues would probably like me to give is to move to a more future-looking reporting technology, such as Power BI or something like that. But yeah, for if you're sticking with legacy platforms that depended on direct SQL access, that's the best fit as your BYOD.
Awesome. So Dylan had a question actually relating to Power BI. Do you see Azure Data Lake as potentially solving the performance issues with Power BI?
Dylan's got some interesting. So that's I haven't played with data lakes. I mean, I keep getting my hopes up, and then the feature just keeps having issues. So I can't super competently answer that. But what I will say is that and I mentioned this in the video, like right now, the performance issue that I see is mostly around the limitations of the OData endpoint and doing those queries live. So I would say it's going to be at least as helpful as BYOD. But I have not personally had a chance to play with it too much. So if anybody's got experience in the chat with that, I would be curious. I'm not trying to crowdsource the answer here, but I am personally curious if anybody's seen huge performance gains by throwing anything out into data lakes.
All right, I see kind of a question here from Edmundo. He's thinking that they can create their own extensible controls and leverage JavaScript data visualization tools, similar to chart control built by Microsoft. Would that be something you can use as like an external reporting tool?
I don't think he's talking about external there. I think he's talking about an extension to the application itself, which is an interesting idea, Edmundo. I know that like early on in the X7 product cycle, we had that capability. And yeah, I guess that's what, if you wanted visualizations directly in the system, yeah. It's not a bad idea. I'd be kind of curious about like if you had huge amounts of data, if you'd be constrained by the way that forms load in F&O. That's the only downside I could think of on that. But that's an interesting idea. I haven't explored that since the very beginning of the X7 product cycle. So worth bringing up for sure.
All right. Looks like Jumi had a question. What would be the best reporting tool that you would suggest for drill down?
For drill down, okay, so it's been, I think it got broken in SSRS. Well, okay, for drill down, okay, so here's what I'd say. Probably Power BI. It depends on like what you're drilling through to and how much it would take to copy those data sources out to something that Power BI could see. For like simple drill down, we used to use SSRS, but that feature's like come and gone and come and gone. And you're only really able to link through to a single form. So if you wanted like a really rich drill down experience on a report, probably Power BI would be the smartest place to do that. I can't believe somebody who was originally very against this. I should probably also mention if you're trying to like do something and it's like more of a feedback loop than just a report, there are some scenarios where maybe like a Power App makes sense. I've seen a few of those lately, but yeah, for reporting, I think Power BI wins on the drill down game. Oh, we're down to a minute, John. Let's see.
All right.
Or 30 seconds. Well, last question. Sorry, guys.
Last question. Let's see. Alariza, how about when it applies to huge data quantities? Which one can be considered?
Okay, I still it's high maintenance, but the entity store with non-clustered column store indexes probably still the best like native technology. Not in my experience, not used a lot, but that's a quick answer. Okay, with the 10 seconds I got left, I got to mention the website there. So the conversation continues over on the DynamicsCon website. So be sure to head over there if there's any open questions. This has been a thoughtful group, so I appreciate all the good questions, and hopefully we can keep discussing over there. And Ray, I hopefully didn't go over. I think we can wrap. Thanks, everybody.